All right, well, you made it to the end. Congratulations. And I have some experience. By the way, my name's Russ Olsen, and I'm going to be talking to you here, but I have some experience organizing conferences. And mostly what you discover if you organize a conference is that it is long and hard and frequently boring and thankless work. There's absolutely nothing we can do about the long and the hard and the frequently boring, but I think we can do something about the thankless. Can I get a round of applause for the people who organized this thing? So as I say, my name's Russ Olsen. By way of introduction, I've been a software developer since before that word was coined. I've written a couple of books, if I can get my thing to work, mostly on Ruby. And if you write books, there are these magic moments, right? It's another one of those long and boring kind of processes. But when you get that first paper copy of your book, it's really thrilling. And then for me, there was another unexpected thrill out of writing my first book, which was the very first language that my first book was translated in was Polish. And so, thank you all. So I have kind of a different kind of talk here tonight for you. And we've had a lot of questions asked in this conference these past couple days. We've wondered about postmodernism. We've thought about whether we're explorers. We've asked, how can we be more optimistic? We've asked, can we secure our computers? Apparently not. But so this talk is really about another question, a really kind of big question, an important question. And the question is, why? Why do you do this, right? Well, you're all software developers, I think, for the most part. Why? Yeah, it pays pretty well, I think. It can be interesting, but it's also, again, long and frequently boring, right? You look for that bug for 2 days, and then you find it, and it takes 30 seconds to fix, right? And you're like, right? It's a frustrating profession at times. Why do we do it, right? Yeah, it pays well, but you're all very capable people. You're hardworking, you can go out. If you're in this room, there is a million things you're capable of doing, but you choose to do this. Why? And the problem with why questions is they tend not to have an answer that you can say in a sentence or two. And I'm not sure how you answer the why question, but I have an idea, and I want to try something with you here tonight. I want to try and talk about the why question by telling you a story. It is a story that's very close to my heart. I think it's a fun story. So if nothing else, you can sit back at the end of this wonderful conference, rest your brain a little bit, and have a little bit of fun, listen to a story. I think it's a fun story. I think it's an exciting story. But I also think that this story has little things to teach us about software development and great big things. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you the story, and then I'm going to circle back at the end and try and make the case that this story has things that tell us, large and small, about software development, and in particular, it can inform the question of why. So here goes. Here comes my story. It is the summer of 1969, and it's hot. And I mean, it's really hot. And when it gets hot like this, people go a little crazy. Sometimes it feels like the whole world is going crazy. And certainly in the Western world, here in the summer of 1969, it feels like society is coming apart. In the UK, there are strikes. Whole industries are just walking off the job for weeks at a time as the country kind of grinds to a halt. In France, there are these enormous student-led demonstrations that are shutting down the whole country. In the United States, it's protests against the Vietnam War. Large, growing, sometimes violent protests against the Vietnam War, and it just feels like society might be coming apart at the seams. And it's not just the heat and the civil unrest. It's also the pace of change. Because here in the summer of 1969, things are changing really rapidly, and I'll give you an example. There are more and more of these things popping up They're wildly expensive, and there's not very many of them, but there are these things called computers that most people don't understand. And in the summer of 1969, computers are changing really rapidly. They're changing so fast that those kind of odd people who work with computers, there's not very many of them, and they're quite frankly a little weird, they have had to learn a new word. That word is megabyte, because it is now possible here in the summer of 1969. It's unbelievable, but it's now possible to buy a computer with not one, not two, not three, but 4 megabytes of memory. Can you believe it? And that memory is cheap now. It's cheap. It'll only cost you 100,000 US dollars per megabyte. But if you want real crazy, aside from the heat and the pace of change, look no further than the Cold War. Here in the summer of 1969, the Cold War has been going on for 25 years. The world is divided, right? And for most people, which side of that divide you're on is just fate. I was born here, so that makes us, us, and them. I was born over there, that makes us, us, and them. And the thing with the Cold War is that both sides have been armed to the teeth, sitting there for 25 years, the guns loaded, each side waiting for the other side to make the first move, or make the first mistake, or to sneeze. And you better hope nobody sneezes. You really better hope nobody sneezes, because they, whoever they are, whichever side they is, they have thousands of nuclear weapons. The good news is, so do we. Big deal, right? And if somebody does sneeze, if somebody pushes that actual button, we all have about 15 minutes to live as those bombs go flying. So here in the summer of 1969, we are living life, hanging on by our fingernails, living life 15 minutes at a time. It's just crazy. But for once, at least in the West, there's something in the newspapers that's pushing the news about the heat and the civil unrest and even the Cold War out of the newspapers. It's Apollo. It's the project to land a person on the moon. Oh, but don't get me wrong, Apollo is all about the Cold War. See, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, the Soviets, the Russians, as the Americans called them, were doing all kinds of amazing things in space. They launched the first Earth satellite, incredible achievement. They put the first person in orbit, unbelievable achievement. They got the first picture of the far side of the moon. Really, really crappy picture, but it was an achievement nevertheless. And so the Cold War was like a chess game. They make a move, we have to respond. And the Americans felt like they had to respond. The Americans were going all around the world saying, be on our side, we're the smart ones, we're gonna win. And there are the Soviets doing all these amazing things. So the Americans had to respond. So John Kennedy was president of the United States at the time, and he got his advisors together, and they came up with a very simple strategy. And that strategy was based on the idea that if you're behind in a race, the way the Americans were behind in this space thing, it's better to be behind in a long race than a short race, like a marathon. Why is it better to be behind in a long race? Because there's more time to catch up. And so Kennedy just decided to declare a marathon. He went to his advisors and he said, where can we go in space? I don't care where. Where can we go in space that's far away? The advisor said, well, moon's pretty far away. He said, fine, we're going to the moon. Just completely arbitrary goal. And we need a deadline. 1970 is a nice round number. We are going to the moon by 1970. Completely arbitrary goal, completely arbitrary deadline. You guys have never experienced that, have you? So Kennedy got up in front of the world, and he made this speech. And he said, we're going to take a person, send them to the moon, land them on the moon, and return them back to the Earth before 1970. And a funny thing happened after Kennedy made that speech. A funny thing happened was, you would be walking down the street, and you'd see your friend, and you'd say, hey, have you heard about this moon thing? And your friend would say, Yes, they're going to the moon. I mean, that's science fiction. It's Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. And it's us. It's our time. It's happening now. I don't care if it's about the Cold War. We are going to the moon. And so you could tell that Kennedy actually caught some of the excitement because a few months after he made that first speech, he made a second speech. And in that second speech, he said words to the effect, "We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard." Well, it's an interesting way of looking at the world. And so how hard is it to get to the moon? Well, it really depends on how far away the moon is, right? The longer the trip, the harder it's going to be. So, whenever you talk about like astronomical distances, you need an analog. Like if the sun is a watermelon, then the Earth is a pea. And so I have a tennis ball, right? And if this tennis ball is the Earth, then I have this little rubber ball. I don't know if you can see it. But if this is the size of the Earth, this is about the right size for the moon. So you guys have all seen those pictures, right? This is how eclipses work, lunar eclipses. This is how the phases of the moon work, right? You always see this picture, and it's like the Earth is here and the moon is here, and there's shadows and whatnot. All right, so it's a quiz for you. I'm going to tell you that, in my textbook, that's how far away the Earth and the moon were. And I'm going to tell you that's wrong. So who here thinks this is how far away the Earth and the moon are? Anybody? Maybe one or two people? How about this? Anybody think it's this far away? I got somebody there. How about this? Anybody think it's this? A few people. Well, you're all wrong. I can't reach. It's about 2 meters. My arms aren't 2 meters long, but it's about 2 meters away at this scale. Now, here's the thing. When Kennedy said, we're going to the moon by 1970, a few people had started going out into space, right? That's what started it all. It was a handful of Russians and one American. You know how far they'd gotten out into space? Not quite as high as the fuzz on this tennis ball. That's as far as we had made it out into space. And suddenly, we are going 2 meters by an arbitrary deadline. It was just insane. So if you have this project, this insane lunatic project with this impossible deadline, how do you even start, right? What's the right way to get that going? Well, I don't know what the right way is, but I know what they actually did. What they did was everything all at the same time. They tried to think of every single thing they would need to get done to go to the moon, and they started it all. They started a whole series of projects all at the same time. And the plan was to have them all come together basically at the last minute and work perfectly, because that's always a good plan. So one of the things they did, one of the projects they started, they asked themselves, what is the simplest thing that I can do now that will work, right? How do I dumb this down to something I can do right now so that I can learn the ins and outs of going to the moon? So the goal is to take a person from the Earth, take them to the moon, land them on the moon, and return them to the Earth. How do we make that simpler? Well, you think about it for a minute, and you think, oh, leave the person out, right? People like to eat and breathe, and they don't like to be frozen. They don't like to be fried. Like, you can make everything simpler if you leave the person out. Okay, so we're going to have a machine, a robotic spaceship, go from the Earth to the moon, land on the moon, and come back. But that's easier, but is that the simplest thing, the easiest thing that could possibly work? Well, no. Think about it. If you're just sending a machine, don't bring it back. Just leave it there. Just take a machine, send it to the moon, land it on the moon, leave it there. That's easier. Is it the easiest thing we could do? Not quite. We need to talk about what this word land means, right? What if we redefined land as goes screaming in at 5,000 kilometers per hour, splat! Okay, that's landing of a sort, right? And we could put a camera on the thing and we get pictures of the moon getting really, really big till the lights go out. Thus was born Project Ranger, a project to hit the moon with a spaceship. It's the ultimate throwaway prototype. So let's see, Ranger 1 was launched in August of 1961. It's kind of a weird project, right? The goal is to crash, right? And Ranger 1 exceeded expectations. Ranger 1 crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Ranger 2 did better. Ranger 2 crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Ranger 3, in all honesty, Ranger 3 did better still. Ranger 3 made it into space, made it all the way out to the orbit of the moon. The moon was not there at the time. See, Ranger 3 was on its way to the moon, and it was a little bit off course, and all they had to do was like send up a command, basically numbers, to say, turn a little to the left. And turning a little to the left was a negative number. So you can imagine the group meeting after Ranger 3. Who forgot the minus sign? Whose job was it to check the number for a minus sign? So Ranger 3 missed the moon and sailed off into the great beyond. Ranger 3 is still out there. Let's see, Ranger 4 hit the moon. But Ranger 4 died on the way to the moon. It was an electronic brick. It was stone dead by the time it hit the moon. That was success, maybe, no, not really. Let's see, 5. Ranger 5 was apparently worried about Ranger 3 and joined it in the great beyond. So, Ranger 6 flew out to the moon. Takes about 3 days to get to the moon. Ranger 6 flew the 3 days. And at a certain point, the people behind Ranger 6 realized, hey, it's falling towards the moon now, and it's working. This is it. This is the day. And the only thing left to do was turn on the TV cameras to get those cool pictures of the moon getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the TV cameras failed. Ranger 7 worked. Ranger 7 flew out to the moon and took these pictures closer, closer, closer. And this last picture is really just half a picture. This is the last half a picture returned from Ranger 7. And the half picture part of it is kind of a symbol of Ranger 7 working because it took the picture and it was radioing the picture back to Earth when the lights went out. And so you can imagine that the people behind Ranger 7 were drinking champagne and slapping each other on the back and celebrating after they got this half a picture. But you can also imagine that they were thinking to themselves, my God, it took us 2 years and 7 tries to do the simplest thing that could possibly work. How are you going to do the real thing? And the answer was, they were just doing everything all at the same time. So while they were trying to hit the moon with Ranger, they were building these gigantic going-to-the-moon rockets. But at some point, they realized that those rockets were not going to be ready in time to train the astronauts. Right? You don't just need a rocket, you need somebody to drive. And so what they did was they built a whole separate kind of spaceship simply to train the astronauts so that they'd have people with the skills they needed by the time the moon rockets were ready. So this is Gemini. This is a 2-person spaceship that would go up still pretty much in the fuzz, circle the Earth while the astronauts would practice going to the moon things. And they learned a lot from Gemini. In particular, they learned something about steering rockets. Now, you know, airplanes, they sort of steer and point themselves with flaps and rudder, but you can't do that in space. There's no air. So every spaceship has these little steering rockets, just little tiny rockets, and they're placed strategically here and there on the spaceship, and they turn it left and right, up and down, they make it roll. What they discovered in Gemini is what happens if one of those rockets malfunctions and turns on and starts firing and will not stop. And what happens is your spaceship starts to tumble, slowly at first, but then faster and faster and faster. And what they also discovered was that if you have people inside a tumbling spaceship like that, at a certain point, they can't see what they're doing because the world is literally spinning around. But what they also learned was that if you have an astronaut in an out-of-control spaceship, and that astronaut is calm enough to work the problem while his spaceship is literally spinning out of control and can find the right switches to throw without being able to see what he's doing, this is a survivable accident. And survive they did. That is something to know. While they're trying to hit the moon with Rangers, while they're sending people up, occasionally spinning them out of control in Gemini, they're building these huge workshops. And they're building these huge workshops so they'll have a place to build these gigantic going to the moon rockets. And the end result of that is this. This is the largest rocket ever built. It stands 30 stories tall. It weighs 3 or 4 million kilograms. And this whole huge thing only has one purpose. Its sole purpose in life is to throw the very pointy bit at the top, you can barely see it in that picture, see it better there, at the moon. That's the only thing that huge rocket does, because the very pointy bit at the top is the result of yet another project. This is the Apollo mothership. It's designed to keep 3 people alive in space long enough to get to the moon, hang out on the moon for a little while, and come back. It's got air and food and heat. It's got radiation shielding. It's got that big rocket engine on the back to blast them back to the Earth when they want to come back. It's got a heat shield so they'll survive the reentry. It's got parachutes to lower them gently, and it floats because it lands in the ocean. It is a brilliant piece of 1960s technology. There's only one thing wrong with it. The only thing wrong with this thing is that it's too heavy to land on the moon. With the heat shields and the parachutes and the food and the radiation shielding and the big rocket engine, it can go from the Earth to the moon, it can circle around the moon, orbit the moon, and it can come back, but it's too heavy to make that last 60 or 70 kilometer journey down to the surface of the moon. So for that, we have this. This bizarre looking thing is a specialized little spaceship. And it's designed to make that last trip down to the moon, the last 60 or 70 kilometers. And so the plan is for one person to stay in the mothership and for 2 people to get in this thing and fly down to the moon, hang out on the moon for a little while, come back up, and then everybody goes home. So the plan is for these 2 spaceships to fly out to the moon carrying these guys. This is the crew of Apollo 11. These are the first people to try and land on the moon. The guy furthest away from me is Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz Aldrin is kind of the godfather of Ranger 3. His area of expertise is space navigation. His job is to keep them from flying off into the great beyond. Can you imagine why they brought him along? The guy closest to me is Neil Armstrong, and he's the other person who's actually going to try and land on the moon. And we've already met Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong was the guy in that out-of-control spaceship who managed to fix the problem without being able to see what he was doing. Give you 3 guesses why they picked him? The guy in the middle, his name's Mike Collins, is the person who's going to stay on the mothership, who doesn't actually get to land on the moon. And he's got the suckiest job in the universe. His job sucks not just because he doesn't get to land on the moon, it's more about the what ifs. What if something happens to the other 2 on the way down to the moon? What if something happens to them on the moon? What if they can't get back up? In that case, Colin's job is to turn the ship around and leave his friends behind and make the 3-day silent, sad journey back home. That has got to be the suckiest job in the universe. It is July 20th, 1969. It's a Sunday. It's about 4 p.m., 1600. A few days ago, Apollo 11 took off with those 3 guys in it. They've had a quiet, uneventful 3-day journey to the moon. A few hours ago, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into that weird-looking thing, and ever since, they've been on their way down to the moon. They are about to enter the critical last 10 minutes, the final piece of the journey down to the surface of the moon. It's a part of the trip that NASA calls powered descent. Back at Mission Control, there's a room full of people getting ready for war. A lot of these people are in their early 30s, and that means they have spent a substantial portion of their adult lives getting ready for these 10 minutes. And they are deadly serious. Their job is to watch the data streaming down from this little spaceship and be the 3rd, 4th, 27th pair of eyes, making sure it's working. And they mean it. There's an armed guard on the other side of the door. Nobody's getting in or out until this thing is over. They've locked down the circuit breakers on most of their electrical equipment. They'd rather risk a fire than have the lights go out at the wrong moment. Out in the rest of the United States and in various parts of Europe and Asia, there is a blanket of tension that you can almost cut with a knife here at 1600 on that Sunday. In the United States, there's very few cars on the road because most people are inside, glued to their televisions. But it's right around now, it's right around 1600, that something weird starts to happen with those cars that are out on the road. They start to pull off. On city streets, they find a place to park. On highways, they pull off onto the shoulder. On rural roads, they just stop. The drivers can't drive and listen to what's going on above the moon on their car radios. In this very modest house in the city of Philadelphia on the east coast of the United States, a 10-year-old boy and his dad are watching the coverage on TV. They're both sitting on the couch, but it's right around now, it's right around 1600 that the dad gets up from the couch and walks about halfway to the TV. And then he gets down, kind of crouches down, and puts his hand on his head. And that's the way he'll stay until it's over. They're watching this guy on television. This is Walter Cronkite. In the United States in 1969, Walter Cronkite is the king of TV news guys. And Cronkite's thing, the thing that he's known for, is that nothing gets him upset. Nothing gets any emotion out of him. You know, Cronkite is famous for going to war zones and reporting in a very calm voice. So yeah, that was a big explosion. That was very close by. Nothing upsets him. It is 1605, 0 minutes, right at the beginning of that last 10 minutes down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 17 kilometers. They've gone through about a quarter of their fuel to get there, and things are not going well. The problem is that their radio isn't really working. They can talk to the ground for a little while, but then they get these huge blasts of static, and the voice communications drop out, and even worse, the data drops out. And they need that fourth, fifth, 17th pair of eyes in mission control. So they're doing the things that you do to make a radio work. They both have their heads down, and they're changing channels, and they're moving the antenna around. How do you make a radio work? They're doing all of that. And fortunately, they have time to do that because they are not actually flying the spaceship. There's a neat new toy in the world in the summer of 1969. They have a computer to fly their spaceship. Now, it's mostly the rockets and the spacesuits and the spaceships and all the rest of that, the visible stuff, that gets all the attention. But the computer, and particularly the software in this thing, is no less of a leap into the great unknown. And in fact, the woman who designed that software, let me say that again. The woman who designed that software, a woman named Margaret Hamilton, she's come up with it's leaps and bounds beyond what people have been building before. And she sort of thinks that this kind of life or death software that she's building, the techniques that they are developing, it's different than what's come before. And so she has a new name for what she does for a living. She's coined the term software engineering to describe what she does. And the reason that Armstrong and Aldrin have Margaret Hamilton's software is because they are not trying to generically land on the moon, like just anywhere on the moon. They have a specific, pre-selected, really heavily studied spot on the moon that they want to land. Now, when they were planning the mission, there was a lot of disagreement about where they should land. On the one side, you had the geologists and the scientists, the people who study the moon, and they were like, yeah, it's all about the Cold War, we get it, but you need to land someplace geologically interesting. This is the scientific opportunity of a lifetime. And on the other side, there were the astronauts and the engineers, the rocket scientists, and they're like, yeah, whatever, what's geologically interesting? And the scientists are like, the bottom of a valley would be, no, better, the floor of a canyon, but you'd have to get all the way down there. No, the top of a mountain, but you'd have to get the very summit. Or no, even better, the rim of a crater. To which the astronauts and the rocket scientists, the engineers, responded with something like, I'm going to clean it up here. Are you kidding me? Right? And so in the end, it was the rocket scientists and particularly the astronauts who won the argument, because you're not going to win the Cold War with having your little spaceship fall into the crater, right? So Apollo 11 is being steered by that computer and Margaret Hamilton's software, and they are headed for the flattest, dullest, most geologically uninteresting spot on the moon that NASA can find. It is 16:10, 5 minutes into that last 10-minute journey down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are at 10 kilometers. They've gone through about half their fuel, and good news, the radio works. The static's gone away, and the radio just starts working. And you can imagine that maybe Armstrong and Aldrin, they're taking a breath, right? Maybe it's going to go well from here, when a display lights up in front of them and it says 1202. 1202 is a message from their computer. And I know, I don't know if Kurt is here, but I know most of you don't know anything about, certainly I don't know anything about these old guidance computers. So let me see if I can translate 1202 into something a programmer would recognize. Or maybe if you're kind of old school, it would be that. Their computer is having issues. So Armstrong gets on the radio, and he radios down to Mission Control. 1202, what's 1202? You know, there's 1,200 of these codes at least, right? Mission Control has a moment of frozen terror because there's hundreds of these codes. There's one guy in that room. His name is Steve Bales. He's in his 30s. And he happens to know what 1202 means because it came up in a training exercise a few weeks before. And Bales knows that 1202 means that the computer is falling behind. It has a list of things it needs to do, and it's falling behind that list. But he also knows that the computer does the most important things first. And right now, the only important thing is fly the spaceship. So Bales has like 3 seconds to make this decision, and it's literally a life or death decision. So he just says, it's okay, just keep going. Ignore the 1202s. Pay no attention. Except the astronauts can't quite pay no attention. For one thing, there's a bad user interface design. The 1202 appears, and they have to physically push a button to clear that 1202 so they can see the next error code. And maybe the next error code's 1202, okay? But maybe it's 867, which might mean the engine fell off or something, you know? So again, Armstrong and Aldrin, they have their heads down, and they're pushing this button and looking at these 1202s and wondering if these people back at Mission Control know what they're doing. It is 16:12, 7 minutes into that last 10 minutes flight down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin are down to 800 meters. They're down to 20% of their fuel, and good news. The 1202s, they slow down, and then they turn into a trickle, and then they just about stop. And finally, Armstrong has a chance to look up from the computer and the radio and look out the window. He's got this tiny little triangular window in front of him. So he looks up and he looks out the window. Now they're at 800 meters. If you are flying into Zurich or Geneva or London and your airplane's at 800 meters, you're getting ready to land. Your seatbelt is fastened, your tray table is up, right? You can look out the window and see houses and people and cars. At 800 meters, the moon or Geneva or London is not that place on the map. It's not, you know, where you're going next week. At 800 meters, it's here. It's a place. It's all around you. Armstrong looks out the window at 800 meters, and for the first time in human history, the moon is not that light up in the sky. It's not this geopolitical, we're going to win the Cold War by getting there first thing. It's not even the goal that he's been training for years. He looks out the window, and for the first time in human history, the moon is a place. He can see it's all around him. He can look down, and he can see cracks in the ground and rocks, and the ground is scrolling beneath him. He can look off in the distance, and he can see mountains, and the mountains are higher than he is. Now, when I was a kid, I used to wonder sometimes what what was it like to be him? Like, imagine you're in that big, giant spacesuit. You got this glass helmet on. You're looking out that window, and you're looking at that. I don't think Armstrong ever said what he felt at that moment. I don't know how you would feel. I know exactly how I would feel. And the word is terror, stark fear. The moon is a place. It's the wrong place. Armstrong has studied maps and photographs. They made plaster models. He knows exactly what he should see when he looks out that window. And this is not it. And then it gets worse. Because on that window, he's got these little markings. And he can line his eye up with these markings and look and see, like a gun sight, and see where the computer is taking them to land on the ground. And so he does that. He kind of lines up and says, where are we going to land? And he sees this, a very geologically interesting crater. And the crater isn't really that big, but the problem is, well, think about what a crater is, right? Big rock comes down, hits the ground, boom! There's stuff all over the place. This crater is surrounded by a very large boulder field. And the boulders go on forever, and some of them are the size of automobiles. This is not a place to land. So Armstrong looks at that for a few seconds, and then he makes a very Neil Armstrong decision. He clicks off the computer, he turns off the autopilot, and he does two things. He kills most of their downward fall, so they're now falling only very slowly, and he guns it forward. And he does this because he thinks he can see out in the distance, just past the boulders. There's a lot of boulders, but out there past the boulders, it looks like there might be a decent place to land. And he has got to get there before they run out of fuel. Back at Mission Control, right, all this data is streaming down. They can see Armstrong turn the computer off. They can see him kill the downward descent. They can see him zooming forward. The one thing they cannot see is the crater or the boulders. There's no live video feed. So the people in Mission Control, they see all this, and their response to it is extraordinary. What they do is absolutely nothing. And furthermore, the guy running the show at Mission Control, a guy named Gene Kranz, tells everyone in that room that he doesn't want anybody talking to the astronauts anymore. He just wants to send up one bit of information periodically. How much time do they have left? How much time before they run out of fuel? It is 16:14, 9 minutes into that 10-minute last bit of flight down to the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin have sunk down to about 100 meters. They're down to 5% of their fuel, and they are winging over that boulder field. They're going so fast that they don't know how fast they're going. No one ever imagined they'd be going this fast, this close to the ground, so their speedometer is off the range high. And they are whipping across that boulder field, and they can see the edge of the boulders coming up, and it does look like there's a decent place to land. It's 16:16, 11 minutes into that last 10 minutes of flight. Armstrong and Aldrin are down to 3% of their fuel. They're down to 10 meters. And now Armstrong, they're past the boulders. This does look like a decent place to land. And Armstrong is jamming on the brakes to get the thing to stop so he can lower it the last little bit to the ground. It's right around now that they get the first ominous warning from the ground. It's just two words, 60 seconds. You have 1 minute of fuel left. Armstrong barely hears them because now he's lowering the thing like a helicopter down. At a certain point, he loses sight of the ground because their rocket engine is blowing up all this dust, but the ground is down there. He knows it's down there. It's down there somewhere. And it's at this point that he gets the second warning from the ground. Again, it's just two words, just two calm words, 30 seconds. And what those two calm words mean is, for God's sake, land this thing. Aldrin looks out the window and reports that he can see a big shadow. It's the shadow of the spaceship on the ground. They are really close now. And then Aldrin looks down at his console, and there's a little light labeled contact. And the astronauts call it the contact light. And as he looks at it, it comes on. Contact light means that the sensors on that weird-looking spaceship, on the legs, have touched something hard. Contact light means they're on the ground. Contact light means that these two guys are not going to die and better, they're not going to fail. Contact light means that Armstrong and Aldrin, that those people back in mission control, that NASA, that humanity has arrived. It is 16, 17, 14. But Armstrong and Aldrin are not quite done. The plan had been for them to turn off the rocket engine just a little bit over the moon, maybe a meter, and let the thing fall the rest of the way. But they were too busy not dying to do that. And so they're now sitting on the moon, burning the last of their fuel, kicking up rocks and dust, and they need to shut down this barely tested, brand new, very complicated machine full of explosives, or mostly empty of explosives at this point, but still explosives, very carefully. So they have a checklist that they run down, and they do it together. You know, one of them will read the item, the other one will throw the switch, and then the first one will check. They pair astronaut. And so Armstrong starts, he says, shut down, and Aldrin says, okay, engine stop, ACA out of detent. And they go through this long checklist of mumbo-jumbo shutting down the rocket. Meanwhile, people back at Mission Control, they can see that the little spaceship has stopped. And they can see Armstrong and Aldrin turning everything off, and they can hear them talking to each other. And you would think that at a moment like this, somebody would say something profound, something historic. And that's really not how people are. And so the guy in Mission Control radios up and says words to the effect, "We think you landed." Really? Duh? Huh? Armstrong doesn't even respond to that because he's still coming to the end of the checklist. Then he clicks off the last thing. He says, engine arm off. And then he says the words that he had practiced, the words that he wanted to be the first official words from the moon. He says, Houston, Mission Control's in Houston, Texas, Tranquility Base here. They had landed on a place on the moon called the Sea of Tranquility, and Armstrong is making the point that this is the human outpost on the moon. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle, it's the name of the little spaceship, has landed. And with those words, that room full of nerdy engineers at Mission Control, highly disciplined with their white shirts and their black ties, as a group, stand up and start shouting. You can imagine there's some shouting going on in the cars. Remember the cars pulled off to the side of the road? You can imagine, right, what you do if you pulled your car off to the road and you're listening to this on the radio and then you realize it happened, right? Maybe you'd pound on your steering wheel and shout and then look around to see if anybody's watching you. Certainly there was some shouting going on in that house in Philadelphia. It takes just a few minutes, a few seconds really, for the 10-year-old boy to realize, hey, they've done that. This is real. They did it. They really did it. And then he realizes that his dad is no longer down in that crouch, but his dad is jumping up and down and shouting louder than he's ever heard his dad shout. And then the boy realizes it's not just his dad who's shouting, it's the people next door, and it's the people on the other side, and it's the people across the street, and it's the people on the back street. The whole neighborhood is shouting. And it's the kind of noise that comes in waves, and you sort of feel it in your stomach more than you hear it, and so it'll be really loud, and then it'll trail off, and you think it's going to end, and no, it gets really loud again. And then amidst all the shouting, the 10-year-old boy looks back at the TV, and he sees the second incredible thing of the day. Because there on TV, just for a second, camera cut away, but he saw it just for a second. It was there, he saw it. Just for a second. He saw Walter Cronkite crying. That's it. That's my story. Thank you. Thanks. I have told this story to people in ones and twos and fives and tens and in the hundreds. And I always sort of start by saying, hey, I have this story, it's my story. But I want to say to you guys, it's not my story, it's your story. You get this story for being one of us. If you show up at a conference like this, if you live and breathe software, if you just live to build the next thing, this story belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. It's part of our cultural inheritance. And I don't care if you were born here in Poland or in Germany or the old Soviet Union or Africa or Asia, there are things that people like us all share, and I think this is one of them. There are stories from the old Soviet Union and Russia. There are stories from all over the world. I think this is one of my favorites, but it's part of our cultural heritage, and it's your story as much as it is mine. But I did make the point that, or its claim that this story has little things to teach us about software development and great big things. So let me try to make that argument. And the thing, I think the little thing that this story teaches us about software development is that little things in a complex technological endeavor like landing on the moon or building a complicated software system, little things can kill you. Let's think about all of the things that went wrong in that last 10 minutes down to the moon, right? And I'll give you a preview. It's all little things, right? Why did their radio stop working, right? They had 3 days to try out that radio, and it worked fine, and then they were in that last 10 minutes, and their radio stopped working. Why is that? Well, it turns out that a few months before Apollo took off, the engineers behind this weird-looking spaceship got worried about the steering rockets. Remember steering rockets? They're the bane of our existence. It wasn't that the steering rocket was going to malfunction. It was that the weird shape of this thing meant that some of those steering rockets were pointed quite close to the skin of this spaceship. And they were worried that some of those rockets were going to burn through the very thin skin of the spaceship. So they put these shields on it to make sure that didn't happen. There's 2 of them circled there. They're just curved pieces of sheet metal to make sure that the rocket didn't burn through the skin. You know what else curved pieces of sheet metal do really well? They reflect radio waves. And it turned out that at certain angles, like if you were flying upside down facing the moon and the Earth was over here, the reflections from those shields would screw up your radio communications. Couple of little pieces of sheet metal and their radio failed. In a complex technological endeavor, little things, the details, can kill you. Why did their computer crash? They had this, that software, that computer was brilliantly put together. Why did it crash? It crashed for 2 reasons. One, there was an actual hardware fault in the electronics, and the computer was being interrupted more often than it should have been. That's problem number 1. But it wasn't interrupted often enough to really make a difference, so it was just a small hardware fault. Problem number 2 was in the cockpit there was a switch, and the switch told the computer what it should pay attention to. In one position, it should just pay attention to the ground. How high are we? How fast are we going? That kind of thing. And that's where it should have been set during the landing. Unfortunately, it was set to pay attention to the ground, but also watch the mothership in orbit up above. So it was doing essentially twice as much work. And with the extra fault, the hardware fault, it couldn't keep up. And so it started crashing. Little things can kill you. Switch in the wrong position, a minor hardware fault, and your computer crashes at precisely the wrong time. Why were they off course? What happened there? Why were they off course? They had this pinpoint landing picked out. They were off course. Well, to understand why they were off course, you have to go back to when these 2 spaceships were hooked together. When those 2 spaceships were hooked together, there was kind of a tunnel that ran between them so that the people could pass back and forth. And when they got ready to separate, they would close the hatch at one end, close the hatch at the other, pump out the air, and separate. Well, they didn't quite pump out all of the air. And so when they separated, you think maybe they had something on their mind? When they separated, there was a puff of air that changed the velocity of that little lander by 0.5 meters per second. This is 0.5 meters per second. Right? I'm walking 0.5 meters per second. What possible difference could 0.5 meters per second make in a spaceship that was going almost 5,000 kilometers per hour? Well, do the math. 0.5 meters per second is 1,800 meters, 1.8 kilometers per hour. This happened 2 or 3 hours before they landed. Do the math, right? What difference could 0.5 meters per second make? The distance between a nice, boring landing zone and the crater of death. That's what a little thing can do if you leave the problem fester. But they managed to overcome. See, the thing is, if you tried, between these two spaceships, there are about 3 million separate parts. If you tried to worry in excruciating detail about every single one of those 3 million parts, well, maybe you'd be ready to leave for the moon next week, right? So what they did was they tried their best to get the details right, and then they built a system to deal with the failures that happened, and that system was built on two things. The first one's trust, right? Think about what happened when the computer crashed. Armstrong asked Mission Control, what do we do? Mission Control asked Steve Bales. Steve Bales thought about Margaret Hamilton's software, and then he gave the answer, and everybody just trusted. Think about what happened when Armstrong turned off the autopilot and started flying manually. The people in Mission Control did not radio up and say, hey, what are you doing, Neil? Yo! Instead, they just trusted them. Apollo succeeded because there was a chain of trust 300,000 kilometers long. So trust is the first thing they used. The second thing is leadership, right? Leadership, at least the way I think of it, is people working together to do the messy, nasty, boring parts of a job and get it done all the way. And in particular, I think we in the software industry need to get our minds straight about the difference between a leader and a hero. A hero is just somebody who does it and it's easy and that kind of stuff. And a leader is the person who gets a bunch of people together to do a difficult job where people make mistakes. It's not perfect. And I'll give you the best example of that I can think of is this picture, right? This picture has come to symbolize those landings, taken a few hours after the landing. It's a wonderful, beautiful, heroic picture. As an American, I got to tell you, it grabs me every time I look at it. And that's the problem with it. It looks like it was easy. It looks like there were these perfect people, and they were brilliant, and they built this perfect machine, and they flew to the moon, and there was no problems. We know that's not what happened. You know what I like better than this picture? I like the shutdown checklist. Remember the shutdown checklist? I like the shutdown checklist. I like it because it's the words of two people working together to try and finish the job at the end of a long and really hard day. And there's something else I like about these words. I like that there are words. They're written in completely incomprehensible jargon. They're the kind of words that I use. They're the kind of words that you use in your work, right? You can go to work on Monday and say something almost as incomprehensible as this. These are the words of people like us. You know what else these words are? They're the first words spoken from another world. I like that they're real words. I like that there are two people trying to finish a job. I like that there are words. And that kind of brings me to some of the bigger lessons of Apollo. Well, I think one of the bigger lessons of Apollo is that when you do something technically cool, technically sweet, there's all these side effects, and you can't predict what you will get. And some of the side effects can be amazing. And I'll give you an example. We thought we'd go to the moon. The Americans thought they'd go to the moon and, win the Cold War and maybe pick up some rocks and maybe look around at the moon. And something unexpected happened on the way to the moon. Funny thing happened on the way to the moon. We looked back. We looked over our shoulder and we saw that. We saw our place in the universe. We saw ourselves, right? I know for most of you in this room, pictures like this, they're just part of the wallpaper. You've seen them 1,000 times. You'll see them 1,000. They don't even register. I would like for you to try to imagine that you had gotten to a certain point in your life having never seen anything like that. And then one day, somebody comes and puts it down in front of you. What would you say? How would you feel? I can tell you. You say, oh my God, that's everything. That's all of us. It's everything we have. It's everything we've ever known. That is every birthday. It's every first day of school. It's every math test. It's every graduation. It's every first date. It's every love affair. It's every wedding. It's every wedding anniversary. It's every funeral. It's every birthday. And here's the unexpected part. And then you look at it for a little while longer, and you say, my God, it's beautiful. It's tiny. It's out there in the black. Maybe we should take care of it. Yeah, I think we should take care of it. In my opinion, it's no coincidence that pictures like this came along at almost exactly the same time as modern environmentalism as a mass political movement. You just look at the picture and it comes to you. Maybe we should take care of it. And so there's this huge irony that Apollo, this macho, Cold War, almost military, scientific project, helped give us Earth Day, right? You build something cool, you can't predict the side effects that come out from it. And that, that kind of brings me to what I think of as like the final lesson of Apollo, and the lesson that kind of goes back to the why question that I asked in the beginning. And it's something I have a hard time putting into words. Mostly I think of it as conversation. Maybe you and I go out to lunch. Maybe you and I. We go out to lunch. Think we can find some good food here? And one of us, it doesn't matter which, has an idea, and it doesn't matter what the idea is. Like maybe I want to get rich selling pet food on the internet. Maybe you want to mine the seafloor or colonize Mars. Doesn't matter, right? And so we're talking about the idea, and maybe you decide you don't like the idea. And so you start telling me, hey, Russ, no, nobody's going to pay for that, right? It's not valuable. And sure, maybe you could make me believe that. Or maybe you could tell me, hey, it's just going to make society more unfair. It's going to be bad for people. And sure, maybe I'd believe you. Or maybe you just say, I don't know, it's bad for your teeth. It'll make your hair fall out. Sure, possible. The one thing you can't tell me is that it is not possible. In my heart, I won't believe you. See, I'm familiar with the impossible. I saw it done on TV when I was a kid. The ultimate lesson of Apollo for me is that when you do something technically sweet, when you build the best thing that you can, well, you have the thing, congratulations, maybe you'll get rich. But there's this second effect that comes out from it. It's a wave of belief. You make people believe. If she can do it, maybe I can do it. You make people believe in the possibilities. If he can do something like that, maybe I can do something like that. You make people believe in themselves. I can do something. I know this for a fact. I know this for a fact because I am the result of one of those waves. I am a child of Apollo. I sat on that couch and my life changed. It got off of whatever path it had been on, and it got on a different path, one that led me to the university, to engineering, a little while later to writing books, a little bit after that to doing conference talks, and a little bit after that being here with you tonight. So for me, the ultimate lesson of Apollo really has nothing to do with rockets or the moon or space travel or any of that, and it has everything to do with belief. So why do we build this stuff? I can't answer for you, but I can answer for myself. My answer is we build the best thing we possibly can. We build it because it's worth building. We build it because we build it for ourselves, and we build it for our family. We build it for our colleagues. We build it for our coworkers. And most of all, we build it for the next bunch of 10-year-olds. So for me, in the end, it all comes down to the words that started it all in the beginning. We choose to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Conference is just about over. I wish you all safe travels home, and more, with all my heart, I hope that when you get there, you build something hard. Thank you very much.